Welcome everybody. We have a variety of topics to talk about in this video. It's going to be more informal than my usual style so we can move through these topics efficiently. I won't be citing very many sources in contrast to a lot of my other videos on these topics. It'll be more of a conversational style, and if there's anything that emerges in the comments as a theme, something that people are interested in, then we can certainly go back and dig a bit more deeply. So here are the topics for today. God praying in Jewish tradition, a brief intro into mysticism, and that will be necessary to talk about the first point about God praying. More clues to Muhammad's mysticism and his companions. This will be interesting. We'll look at things that everybody knows in the Hadith collections that you can kind of read over and miss what's there, at least what I think is there, if you have a bit of background in mystical text. Possibly some comparisons with the Bible, just depending on how long this video goes. We'll see if we fit that in or not, just to anticipate some objections from our Muslim friends. We'll talk about why this matters so much for Islamic theology, cover Tawheed and the mystical concept of God's oneness. It's an interesting parallel there that we'll look at, and some reflections on mystic theology as well. So I didn't just wake up one day and decide to make Muhammad into a mystic. That's just where my research pointed time and time again. I start down this rabbit trail of research and run into mysticism over and over. I was very encouraged to find that scholars had published on this topic in peer-reviewed journals, noting the connection between Muhammad and mysticism, and also Merkabah mysticism specifically. Now, in this video, we're going to cover a range of different mystical ways of thinking, and I'm not going to distinguish between the different modes of thinking or the different timelines along the development of Kabbalah. I will only when that's important, but it's interesting to talk about a range of different issues. Now, Allah praying has been a big topic. Christian Prince, David Wood, Sam Shamoon, the ECCI has done a lot, both at Speaker's Corner and on their channel, about the prayers of Allah. That's firmly established that Allah prays. I'm not actually going to deal with any Muslim comments on this channel, on this video, who say Allah doesn't pray. You're just deceiving yourself. It's interesting, Droge's translation, for example, surely God and his angels pray for the prophet, you who believe pray for him too. The translation is very true to the Arabic, but there are many translators who obscure this, and they'll do things that are pretty gratuitous from a translational perspective. They'll take the same verb, for example, and make it passive for Allah, but then active for the angels, so that Allah receives prayers, but the angels pray. It's really interesting, given the Quran's numerous condemnations of those who, there are different phrases, twist the words with their tongue, they hide Allah's revelation behind their back, different ways of communicating the way people obscure or conceal the truths that Allah has revealed. But that's a lot of what Islamic scholars do when they're translating the Quran or the Hadith collections or the Tafsir. They're obscuring what the Arabic says. In the case of the Quran, they're obscuring what Allah allegedly said. That's a long way of saying they're a bunch of hypocrites, but Allah does pray. And when we start to hear this, at least from my perspective, okay, Allah prays, this becomes kind of a big issue. The debate with Muhammad Hijab and David Wood, David got up and said, Allah prays for Muhammad, and Hijab said, no, he doesn't, he prays for Muhammad. And so that set off kind of a firestorm because Muslims didn't know about this because it was obscured in the English translation. Well, when you think about that and you have kind of a background in mystical Judaism in their texts, you think, okay, well, Allah prays, and I would like anyone who watches this channel to automatically think, when you hear something odd, whether it's in the Quran or the Hadith collections, when you hear something odd, think, is there anything that came before this? And the answer to that in this case is yes. Okay, you go from Allah praying in the Quran to saying, okay, well, God prays in the Talmud. And we know that the authors of the Quran were in touch with the Talmud. We've talked about that in previous videos. The connection with Mishnah Sanhedrin 4.5 is well known. It's been commented on by a range of people. Okay, so Allah prays in the Quran, God prays in the Talmud, and guess what? That very same text where God prays in the Talmud became instrumental in later mystical Judaism. So we're going to kind of walk through that for the first part of this video and see how that goes. So this is the Sefirot. There's a lot to talk about at this point, but you can think about them as 10 divine emanations from God, or 10 manifestations, okay? 10 fragments of God. There's a lot that Muslims and Christians alike watching this right now are saying this is going to be some really objectionable theology, and it certainly is. So this is a rare topic that Muslims and Christians can agree on this channel. You can look at the way these are organized and see that they roughly correspond to a human body, okay? So head, shoulders, arms. And you'll hear this called the primordial atom in Jewish mystical literature. Now, you have a very important part down here, and this is the Shekinah, or the Shekinah as it's commonly called. A lot of people are familiar with this just hearing it from Rabbinic Hebrew, but don't think about Shekinah or Shekinah in Rabbinic Hebrew and import that into mysticism. It's a bit of a different concept. But Shekinah is the final level before God's divine, his attributes, his I should say his virtues, the divine influx flows down to us through the Shekinah. And the object would be, for example, to unite Tiferet and Shekinah. There is a lot of sexual language within the Godhead, within the Sefirot, and human actions on earth correspond to this. You can use your imagination there. Face to face is a euphemism that you'll read. There's all kinds of crazy stuff. So, for example, Adam, the primordial man, he was a hermaphrodite. Okay, so rabbinic exegesis is extremely odd in many, many cases. In the case of Adam, the Hebrew is not rib, it's side. So, okay, if you take a side from Adam and that side is female, then Adam was a hermaphrodite, right? Really, really bizarre concept. So that's where kind of the face-to-face imagery comes from in here in the Sefirot. When you bring two members of the Sefirot back face-to-face, you're bringing them together in sexual union, which is the objective within some of these emanations. Now, here's the problem. You have 3 upper Sefirot, you have 7 lower Sefirot, so they do, there are divisions among them. All of them are incredibly nuanced. They have different names, they have different colors, which is why you see down here, this is Malkut, but I'm calling it Shekinah because there are different names for them. Meditating on the different names and the different colors of them, they each have colors, that's a form of mystical contemplation, right? of meditation. Meditating on different combinations of consonants in the Hebrew with different combinations of vowels, that's another form of meditation, and that goes into something else that we'll talk about later on. Now, here's the problem. The problem is that the Sefirot are imbalanced, and they're imbalanced because of sin, okay? Apologize to the non-native English speakers and to the English speakers as well, but there's something called Theosophic Theurgic Kabbalah, okay? Theosophic Theurgic Kabbalah. So the Theosophic, the knowledge of God, Theurgic, refers to affecting the behavior of God, okay? And then Kabbalah, KBL, the root, means to receive, not like Muhammad received revelations, but to receive as in tradition, okay? There's a lot of Jewish tradition here, and so you receive this tradition from your fathers, mystic, these Zohar, for example, is traced back, centuries and centuries before. It's actually written by a 12th century Spanish rabbi. So the Sefirot are imbalanced, and using Theosophic Theurgic Kabbalah, where people actually affect the behavior of God, we can bring the Sefirot back into balance. Now, the problem is when the Sefirot are imbalanced, then that impedes the divine influx, okay? God's virtues flowing down to us. Makes it much more difficult, and we can't quite receive God's graciousness that he's sending down to us. You may be picking up on something, and that's that God is not all-powerful in this world in many ways of Jewish mystical thinking. He's all-powerful in his world, the Ein Sof, the infinite, that's God. So you have God, the Ein Sof, then you have 4 worlds most of the time, and then you have the Sefirot, and then finally the Shekinah, of course, one of the Sefirot, and then we're at the bottom. So We really need the Sefirot to be aligned to receive God's goodness, God's virtues. It's early in the morning here. All right, so what we can do then is by studying the Torah, by studying Kabbalah, by just living righteous lives, is we can affect God's behavior. We can put these Sefirot back in order and then allow God's grace, His mercy, His love, and so forth to flow, His provision to flow unimpeded to our world. Now, another problem with the Sefirot being imbalanced is that when they're imbalanced, they weaken. Okay, and when they weaken, they can be more easily overcome by demonic forces. There's a lot of danger of being affected by demonic forces in Jewish mystical thought, and we'll talk about why that's important, and we see some of that in the Islamic texts for sure. Now, let's go back to the Talmud, because think about what we've talked about with the Sefirot, keeping things in order, keeping His attributes, these divine emanations, keeping them balanced. Okay, and let's go back to the passage in the Talmud. This is actually what God's prayer is. May it be my will that my mercy overcome my anger, and that my mercy prevail over my attributes, so that I might treat my children in accord with the trait of mercy, and in their regard go beyond the strict measure of the law. So God's attributes have to be balanced, and mercy is just a little bit above the rest. Judgment, for example. And rabbis would actually signify this in their prayers. But thinking about how God's attributes work together in this passage in the Talmud became very important in later mystical thought. So when you think about Allah praying and you say, well, does that happen anywhere else? Well, yes, it does. It happens in the Talmud, which we already know was known by the compilers of the Quran, and of course by Muhammad, at least as he's portrayed in the Hadith, and it runs us right into mysticism once again. Now, what I want to do is look at a couple of things in the Hadith collections. Like I said, everybody knows this stuff, but we're going to just kind of go through them and then talk about the possible connection to mysticism. And some of them are quite striking, and I'm not going to cite any sources or anything like that. I'm just going to give you a little bit of mystical background, and like I said, we can dig into this stuff a little bit more if desired. All right, Muhammad's repetition. This is a fun one. The Prophet said, the biggest of the great sins are to join others in worship with Allah, to be undutiful to one's parents, give a false witness. He repeated thrice or said a false statement and kept on repeating that warning till he wished he would stop saying it. And here's another one. Muhammad said, he who recites in the morning and in the evening the statement, Subhanallah wa bihamdi, 100 times will not be surpassed on the day of resurrection. Muslims, did you say that this morning? Subhanallah wa bihamdi. Well, here's a possible connection to mysticism. Repetition is a very big part of Jewish mystical contemplation. Okay, so I mentioned before the names and the colors of the Sefirot, also the consonants of the Hebrew alphabet. If you point them differently, give them different vowels, they sound different. And there are actual texts that have some of these written out, and you are to say them over and over again, and to induce, a meditative state. So repetition is a big part of mystical practice, but there's also something else, and that's specifically with respect to throne mysticism or Merkabah mysticism. In this form of mysticism, the mystic attempts to see what Isaiah saw in Isaiah chapter 6 or Ezekiel when they actually saw a vision of God on his throne. Okay, throne, Merkabah, that's where this term comes from. So the mystics are trying to recapture that. And the reason, there's a lot that goes into this. A lot of this is actually really sad, and we'll talk about that at the end of the video. But with the temple being destroyed in AD 70, there's a loss of God's closeness. Okay, God's more distant. He's less accessible. And what are you going to do as a Jew who's, a religious Jew, you're practicing the Torah, the law, and so forth? What are you going to do about that if you're not going to believe in the Messiah? Well, you have to have some sort of a replacement for that. And so the mystics sought to reestablish the connections that the prophets of old had. And so they're trying to see the throne again. They're trying to see God, wanting to feel close to God. A lot of mysticism just has to do with that last thing, feeling close to God. And this is, kind of what's behind Merkabah mysticism. It was the first major strand of mysticism that emerged about the 2nd century or so, I think, is where Gershom Scholem places those. So we have repetition. Once again, there's repetition in Jewish mystical practices. Muhammad's suicide attempts. Of course, numerous attempts. They're recorded in his biographies as well as the Hadith collections. A mystical journey can be compared to a flight. Okay, you have pre-flight training, you have the flight, and then you are debriefed after the flight. There's also another analogy, and that's that of crash landing. Okay, the Merkabah mystics rarely actually make it through the 7 chambers to the throne room of God. By the way, as you're going through each one of these chambers, speaking of repetition as we did, you have to repeat a requisite number of times the names of the angels, which are increasingly long and complex as you're going through. And you can't mess up. If you mess up, or if you do any number of other things, if you're deceived, or there's a lot we could talk about here, an interesting parable with 4 rabbis. But basically, if you don't make it to the throne room, and there's a really big chance you won't, then you crash land. Okay, there are psychological effects that can occur. Depression, suicide, and so forth. You can die, can be killed in some way, or you can be driven mad, you can be driven insane. Now, as you progress through different forms of mysticism, a lot of what's in the Talmud could be called normal mysticism, but as you get up to Merkabah mysticism, you not only increase your chances of a heavenly journey, but you increase your chances of being exposed to demonic forces. So there's a danger. And the higher and higher you attempt to go in your mystical journey, the greater that chance is. So the parable of the 4 rabbis I mentioned earlier, one of the rabbis is driven insane because the experience just overwhelmed him. So when you think about Muhammad, why was he so depressed? Why did he commit suicide? There's a parallel there. Why did he try to commit suicide? There's a parallel there in that if you fail in your mystical journeys, as he did over and over again, we see that in the Hadith collections, then you have some sort of a psychological effect. And depression could certainly be one of those, and hence Muhammad's suicide attempts. The nearness of Satan. As I said, the more you open yourself up to these mystical experiences, the more you open yourself up to possible demonic influence. And it's interesting to see in the Hadith collections how near Satan is, whether he's sleeping in the bridge of a nose of someone or urinating in someone's ear. If you forget a prayer, forget how to say a prayer, forget the Quran, according to Muhammad in the Hadith collections, then that's because of Satan. I mean, Satan is right there. He's right there ready to get you. And it's interesting to think about in mystical thought how vulnerable you become to demonic influences because you're trying to attain a heightened spiritual status. Isolation, of course, we know that Muhammad developed a love of isolation. We can look at that hadith. We have Muhammad in Sahih Bukhari, and he has the love of seclusion. It was bestowed upon him. He used to go into seclusion in a cave. This is trademark mysticism, okay? Lots of seclusion, isolation involved in order to attempt to disconnect from distractions and to focus on the mystical experience. Debriefing after the flight. Remember I said you can compare it to flight training or something like that. After the mystic comes down from his mystical journey, he will often talk to his mentor so that the mentor can help him interpret what he saw and what he heard. Think about this hadith. Waraka was a learned old man, and Muhammad came back from his vision, didn't really know what he saw, and so he's taken to the old man who interprets what Muhammad saw for him. I put this in here just as a reminder. Merkabah mysticism, once again, throne, Merkabah. That's specifically what Muhammad was involved in. I mentioned it was the earliest strand of mysticism, and Jewish mysticism eventually became more distinct throughout the Middle Ages. So you have drawing down divine grace. Theosophic, theologic, Kabbalah, I mentioned that earlier. Merkabah mysticism, you have hybrids of these. You have normal mysticism, mystical intimacy, and so forth. But these weren't so distinct, certainly in Muhammad's time, but Merkabah mysticism was the earliest one to emerge. If you watch the video, Muhammad, the Mystic and the Boy Under the Blanket, you know why Merkabah mysticism is specifically what Muhammad was into, because of the whole issue with Ibn Sayyid. They talk about the throne, actually saw the throne with the creatures, the Hayot, and so forth. So I don't want to give the impression that I'm being anachronistic when we talk about the Sefirot, for example. That's not in Merkabah mysticism. But these things became distinct later on. These forms of mysticism, developed a lot over time. And so now we can kind of look back around the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries and see these distinct forms of mysticism. But Merkabah mysticism was certainly the earliest. The use of a recorder or a scribe, these last two are particularly fascinating to me. Everyone knows that Muhammad had a sort of a secretary. He had a scribe. But notice this. Zayd ibn Thabit said, I was sitting beside the Apostle of Allah when the divinely inspired calmness overtook him. And the thigh of the Apostle of Allah fell on my thigh. When the divinely inspired calmness overtook him. Okay, that's critical. There's another one. Abu Bakr sent for me and said, you used to write the divine revelations for Allah's messenger. And this is Zayd ibn Thabit speaking again. So here's the connection. The mystics were too caught up in their supernatural experience to write what they saw and what they heard. And you can see in mystical writings where they talk about having a secretary, a scribe, sitting next to them. And the mystic tells them to write. Start writing what I'm seeing, he'll communicate it, or what I'm hearing. And the scribe next to the mystic, at the time the revelation is received, remember this hadith, Zayd ibn Thabit said, I was sitting beside the Apostle of Allah when the divinely inspired calmness overtook him. And the Apostle of Allah said, write down. This is just explicit mysticism right here. You have the person sitting next to the mystic, while this divine revelation is occurring, and this person is writing down for the mystic. Pretty explicit parallel, I think. Abu Hurairah also used a garment or a sheet. Remember, this is a typical practice, Jewish and Arabian mantic practice, and we talked about this in previous videos. Now notice closely what is said. Allah's messenger once said, whoever spreads his garment till I have finished my present speech and then gathers it to himself will remember what I say. Okay, so we're getting there. We're in the ballpark, but notice this hadith. Abu Hurairah said, Allah's messenger, I hear many narrations, but I forget them. Muhammad said, spread your covering sheet. He did. Muhammad moved his hands as if scooping something, emptied them into the sheet, and said, wrap it. How did Muhammad receive his revelations? Wrapped in a blanket. I, that is Abu Hurairah, wrapped it around my body, and since then I have never forgotten. It seems as if Muhammad the mystic had a disciple. Let's think of some, possible objections that Muslims might want to offer, and these are all going to be terribly flawed. We think about Elijah giving his mantle to Elisha. 1 Kings 19:19, Elijah passed by Elisha and cast his cloak upon him. So this could be a symbolic action of adoption. That's what some commentators think, kind of in a weird ancient Near Eastern way. Later on, Elisha uses Elijah's cloak. Then he took the cloak of Elijah that had fallen from him and struck the water, saying, where is the Lord, the God of Elijah? So there's a physical object involved, as it is many times. Moses had a staff. Elisha here has the mantle that Elijah had given him. But Elisha knows where the power comes from. He says, where's the Lord, the God of Elijah? So there's no mystical contemplation or anything involved here. Muhammad made some sort of symbolic gesture and then told Abu Hurairah to wrap himself in the cloak and all of that nonsense. Now, when you think about Ezekiel and Isaiah, these other throne visions that they had, these were not Merkabah mystics. That's utterly anachronistic. They had a vision of God. The Merkabah mystics later tried to see that for themselves. Okay, they tried to replicate what Isaiah and Ezekiel saw. Now, in the case of Paul, I really like his language. He was caught up. That's the way God actually works. God kind of burst into Paul's world and said, the train's leaving and you're on it. Now, mystics are a bit different, and this is why this is so problematic, I think, for Islamic theology, because the traditional view is that Allah's revelations came to Muhammad, that the arrow direction of is downward. The arrow points down from Allah through Jibril to Muhammad. But mystics attempt to reverse that. They attempt to ascend. Okay, they attempt to sort of burst into God's throne room in the case of Merkabah mystics. And I think that's very problematic because it completely reverses what we've traditionally been told about Muhammad. So Allah's revelations didn't come to him at all. Rather, Muhammad was trying to receive revelations through mystical experiences. Interesting stuff. Now, what do we want to cover in conclusion? Yes, Tawheed. This is really interesting because I have this is from a PhD, an Islamic scholar. He says, literally, Tawheed means unification, making something one or asserting oneness. And this is from Bilal Phillips. It has to do with making something one. That's what the word means, or unification. Now, Muslims often on my channel will quote the Shema from Deuteronomy 6:4. They have no idea the range of Jewish interpretation of that passage. They'll say something like, well, the Jews would interpret Deuteronomy 6:4. Let me give you an interpretation of Deuteronomy 6:4. Keep in mind the definition of Tawheed in mind. Unification, okay, making something one. Keep that in mind. Now listen to this interpretation of the Shema by a Jewish mystic named Isaac Horowitz. The correct intention in reciting the Shema is that we unite all of the Sefirot. Let's go back to our diagram. Here are the Sefirot, 10 distinct emanations. Back to our quote, that we unite all the Sefirot one with another, and all of them with the emanator, that is the Ein Sof, the infinite God. So let's see if we covered everything I said we would. We talked about God praying in Jewish traditions, so we talked about Allah praying in the Quran to God praying in the Talmud and how that influenced mystical thinking. And we talked a little bit about the Sefirot, the Kabbalah. We looked at more clues pointing us toward mysticism. I hope you read these things a bit differently in the Hadith collections from now on. Talked about some comparisons with the Bible as well, just briefly. I didn't want to spend too much time going through that. We talked about why this matters so much for Islamic theology. Once again, it reverses the arrow of revelation, not down from Allah through Jibril to Muhammad, but rather Muhammad using his own mystical methods to gain whatever knowledge he gained. From the Christian perspective, he gained supernatural knowledge in some cases, but it was from Satan. It's pretty simple. Not only from the Christian perspective, look at this comment I got recently. This is from an agnostic, and Muhammad, and what's said about him was beginning to convince this agnostic that there's a devil and a God. Clearly Islam is the work of the devil. So Islam is convincing this person that evil exists, that Satan exists, and to explain apparently why we're not all just consumed by this evil, there must be a force of good opposing it. So that's really telling for someone to just look at the Islamic religion and start to be convinced about the existence of Satan. We talked about Tawheed and the mystical concept of God's oneness, the Shema, the unification, and how Tawheed is defined as unification as well, or making into one. We'll talk now just a little bit about mystic theology. You've heard a lot of things that are objectionable, both Muslims and Christians. To Christians, specifically, I'd say if you walk into a store right after watching this video and see someone who's an Orthodox Jew, you can tell by the way they're dressed and so forth. You start a conversation and you find out they're a Kabbalist. You might just reflexively say after watching this video, your theology is atrocious. I've heard about this Sefirot and all these divine emanations and the fragments of God, and God's not all powerful in this world, all this stuff. Here's some things to keep in mind. Jewish mystical thinking, theology especially, is actually really sad in many ways. There are numerous times going through mystical texts where I'll write in the margin a scripture verse from the New Testament. Ephesians 2, 1 Corinthians 3, 1 Corinthians 6 would be really good examples, because For example, in Jewish thinking, it's called mystical intimacy. Okay, in this, what you're trying to do in this method is remember the Sefirot, how they're overlaid over the human body. You're trying to get God to dwell, each one of these Sefirot to dwell in your body, so that God's in your arm, He's in your leg, and so forth. They're trying to make the human body a temple for God. That is what these texts say. What about Ephesians 2? The believing body of Christians is being built up into a holy temple of God. What they're trying to do has already been done without all of the mystical trappings. And this happens over and over again. Drawing down divine grace is another category of Jewish mysticism that's distinguished by Byron Sherwin. And in this method, you have a figure called the tzaddik. He's the righteous figure, and he's the one through whom God's divine influx is channeled down to. He replaces the temple in some sense, and from him, the divine virtues are distributed out to others. This is where you would get talismans, charms, and so forth. Okay, he would channel these things into these objects to be distributed to a third party. You can see how that's, once again, we're talking about some kind of weird stuff. But this tzaddik was effectively the human replacement for the temple. Think about what Jesus said, destroy this temple, in 3 days I'll raise it up. Elsewhere, something greater than the temple is here. What they're trying to do is already done by Jesus without the mystical trappings. Over and over again, this happens. They're trying to usher in the Messianic age, okay? The Messianic age will occur, the Messiah will return, He will come when love of Kabbalah, okay, love of these traditions, these received traditions, is felt throughout the world. When people have a desire, have a hunger for Kabbalah, that's when the Messiah will come back. He's already come. So the theology is very weird, absolutely. Some of it is what we would call blasphemous, no doubt. But it's also sad in many ways. These mystics are trying to do themselves what they can't do. They're trying to do what Jesus already did. With the destruction of the temple came a loss of the nearness of God and the accessibility of God from the Jewish perspective. And so a lot of these mystical forms arose from that. They're trying to recover the feeling of the nearness of God. So that's why you have, once again, in mystical intimacy, the gap between people and God is illusory. That's the thinking. And practicing this form of mysticism collapses that gap and shows it to be illusory and reunites the person with God. All things that are readily available in Christian theology through Jesus Christ. So this has been a sort of a wide-ranging discussion in this video, and as I said, it's different from my normal format. I'm not citing source after source. That would be much too long, but I wanted a video where we could kind of loosen up a bit, have more of a conversation, and talk about some of these issues. So hope you enjoyed it, hope it was informative, and I'll see you next time with another fascinating video where we are going to explore the Children's Encyclopedia of Islam. You can imagine how that will go. I'll see you next time.